Today I want to talk about source criticism. We're evaluating it. We're finding that source's value. Every source has values. The key is finding the limits of those values. In other words, you start with the idea that the source is valuable and you try and determine how valuable that source is. What are the values? A historian uses the origin, the purpose, and the content of a source in order to establish what those values are and where the limits to those values are. So when we talk about origin, we're talking about things like who is the author? Not just what their name is, but who are they in relation to the events that we're talking about, the events that we're trying to understand? Are they a participant? Are they a reporter? Are they a historian looking back at those events? Who is that person? Who wrote it? When did they write it? That we want to really look at and try and understand. When was it produced? These are the kinds of questions we want to know about the producer of this source that we can find when we think about the origin of it. So for purpose, we're trying to ask the question, why was this source written? What were the reasons? What were the circumstances of it being written? When we talk about purpose, a lot of times what we're looking at is who the intended audience was. Who did they expect to read this source? For the content, we're looking at what is actually being said, but more specifically, what's being emphasized in this source. So when we evaluate a source, when we try and find the values of a source and the limitations of those values, we're looking at the origin, the purpose, and the content. Those are the things that we look at in order to figure out what the value of this source is for a historian studying a particular topic and what the limit of those values are. So now I want to talk about primary sources versus secondary sources. Primary sources are, of course, those sources that emerge from the time of an event that we're studying. Secondary sources are written by historians, and secondary sources by historians are coming from the primary sources, and they're using the primary sources as evidence. But they're taking those primary sources and they're putting it together to make a larger argument, a historical argument about cause, about consequence, about change over time, about continuity. They're emphasizing certain pieces of significance. One problem that I see students often do is they mistake the word primary for the word better. And they'll say things like, primary sources are valuable, secondary sources are limited. All sources have values. And what we're trying to find is where the limits of those values are. So let's specifically look at primary sources for a second and talk about the OPcVL, the origin, the purpose, and the content in order to establish the value and limitations of a primary source. So the Declaration of Independence is a document written or at least endorsed by elites at the Second Continental Congress in 1776. This is the origin of the document. The purpose of this document was to tell the British that the United States, these new United States, were declaring independence. So who was the intended audience? Well, it was Parliament in England for one, but it was also the colonists. Its purpose was to show that this cause, this declaring of independence, was just. The content of the Declaration of Independence is a list of grievances that ultimately lead to the conclusion that there really is no other choice but to declare independence. It's a logical structure built on Enlightenment ideas. So now we've looked at the origin, the purpose, and the content. And we want to show how the origin, the purpose, and the content illuminate the values, and we want to use those ideas to figure out what the limitations of those values are. So it doesn't really tell us what all Americans thought. It doesn't really give us the perspective of the loyalists. It doesn't give us the perspective of the lower class people. It gives us a particular perspective which is very valuable to us. We get to see what the perspective was from those patriots who are the elites. But we don't see the perspective of the loyalist. We don't see the perspective of the lower classes. We have to look at other sources to be able to put all of that together at the same time, which is what historians are doing with a secondary source. So that's how the origin of the source provides us or illuminates the value and allows us to explore the limitations. So let's continue to look at the Declaration of Independence and think about the purpose of the Declaration of Independence. The intended audience was the British Parliament, but it was also the American people. So this is very valuable because it tells us what they wanted people to see. That's limiting though, because it doesn't necessarily tell us about their fears. Did they have uncertainties when they were writing this document? We don't really know because the document was designed for public consumption. The intended audience was to get people on board with this idea. So they're not going to put into a document where they want people to embrace the idea of independence and be willing to fight for it. They're not going to put into that document potential fears or potential changes of their mind. They're going to put out there what they want people to really see that's going to bring people to their cause. So that's valuable. It tells us what they thought was most important, but it's also a limit. The Declaration of Independence is divided up into 3 parts. The first part is the part that we all tend to memorize in school. The second part, which often gets ignored, is the most important part for them. It was the list of grievances, the problems that they felt the British government had put on the colonists unduly. And so that list of grievances then leads to the third part, where they argue that they have no choice but to separate. So the content is valuable for us because it shows us what they chose to emphasize. They chose to emphasize this list of grievances. They chose to structure it very logically. One of the most famous changes that was made to the Declaration of Independence was that Ben Franklin told Thomas Jefferson that the rights were not sacred, but rather they were self-evident. This choice of words that we find in the content of the Declaration of Independence tells us the importance of Enlightenment ideas, of creating a logical organization to this document. We've looked at the origin, we've looked at the purpose, and we've looked at the content. And the origin, purpose, and content have illuminated the value of this primary source and has also illuminated the limitations of that value. We can see that it's the perspective of the elites. It's something that emphasizes Enlightenment ideas, but does not necessarily talk about the other ideas that were at that time. Perhaps competing ideas, perhaps religious ideas, perhaps ideas of holding on to tradition. It also tells us about the people that they were expecting to read it in the purpose, the intended audience. And so because of that, we can see these are the ideas that they most wholeheartedly felt were important. And therefore, we don't know about those secondary ideas. We are unable through this particular document to be able to get any more insight into their uncertainties. All right, so now I want to talk about origin, purpose, content, value, and limitations, but looking at a secondary source instead of a primary source. So here we have a book called Galileo for Copernicanism and for the Church. The author has spent his life studying the scientific revolution, studying Galileo. It was published in 1994. The book is at this point in 2020 over 25 years old, but that does not necessarily make it a problem, but it is a limit. It's valuable for a couple of reasons because it's not something that was published 100 years ago, but it doesn't take advantage of the most recent scholarship on Galileo or the scientific revolution. Obviously, this author can't reference anybody who has studied this subject after 1994. So this book was published by the Vatican Observatory Press. Now, if we know a little bit outside of the source about the context at that time, in the early 90s, they opened up their archives, and Annabelle Fantoli and a few others were able to go into these archives and do research through primary sources that really hadn't been seen for a very long time. This was one of the products of that. Annabelle Fantoli's book called Galileo for Copernicanism and for the Church. And his argument is that Galileo was not trying to destroy the church, but that Galileo considered himself a good Catholic and a good scientist. That Galileo did not see any kind of division between those two ideas, those two parts of himself. So Fantoli is arguing that there was more harmony between the church and Galileo than most historians have generally talked about. That's the content of the book. So when we go back to the purpose of this book, who is the intended audience? Well, this book was written for historians. It was written for historians of the scientific revolution, historians of Galileo, researchers who really want to understand this period in scientific history. He's looking at sources that were over 300 years old, and he's looking at them with an eye towards the past. He is bringing a perspective to Galileo that Galileo could not possibly have brought, because he's looking at it from 1990s perspective, not from the 16 teens, when Galileo was writing one of his most famous letters. So the origin of this book is that it was written in 1992 by a historian who's an expert on Galileo and the scientific revolution. This is very valuable because he brings to the table a modern perspective on something that is several hundred years old. The perspective is built on a lifetime of scholarship, a lifetime of study, numerous sources that have been written. The purpose of the book was to change the historical debate that in some cases said that there was a very difficult relationship between Galileo and the Jesuits, Galileo and the Catholic Church. And he's saying, no, it was much more harmonious than people think. There was no combat, at least not in the mind of Galileo. So through that origin, purpose, and content, we're able to see that this source is very valuable because it presents a different view of this Galileo affair for historians who are trying to understand the relationship between Galileo and those who put him on trial in 1632. But it is a little bit limited. Another piece of the origin is that it was published by the Vatican Observatory Press. This harmony between the church and Galileo is something that perhaps Fantoli is promoting more so. To say that it is completely wrong, that would be a mistake. The argument is very strong that there was some harmony here. But perhaps because it's being published by the Vatican, this harmonious idea to be the one that becomes the forefront of the historiography. Doesn't mean that we throw it away. But we do need to keep that in mind when we're using that source to do research. One more thing that I want to talk about is bias. One mistake that I see far too often is that students will say, this source is limited because of bias. Bias is not a limitation. Bias by itself is neither a value nor a limit. Recognizing the bias illuminates one of the values and one of the limits of those values for a source. So, for example, to say that Annabelle Fantoli was a Catholic, that Annabelle Fantoli was doing research for the Vatican Observatory Press, certainly illustrates that there might be some bias there. But that's not negative. One of the things that he's bringing to this perspective is this idea that one can be an academic and one can be a good Catholic at the same time. And he brings that idea into his study of Galileo and presents a harmonious thesis about Galileo that in some ways contradicts the work of, say, Pietro Redondi's Galileo Heretic. The Declaration of Independence certainly has bias. It's written by Jefferson. It's written by people and endorsed by people who want to see the United States declare independence from Britain and establish themselves as their own country. Obviously, that bias exists in that primary source, but that's not a limit to the source or a value by itself. It's both. It tells us the perspective of those who wanted independence. But it only tells us the perspective of those who wanted independence. That's what makes it valuable, but also what shows us the limits of that value. Every source has bias. Secondary sources, primary sources, they all have bias. As a historian, we do try and recognize our own bias, our own perspective. I can't help but write and research from my own perspective. But that bias is beneficial. It's what gives us multiple perspectives. So every source, primary or secondary, has bias. So don't say that a source is valuable because it's biased, or certainly that a source is limited because it has its bias. Every source has bias. Every source has values. All of those values have limits. Did I mean literally all sources? Here's a book called How About Them Dogs? And in fact, the intended audience is children. It was written by a former Georgia football coach named Vince Dooley. It was published in 2006 by Mascot Books. So this book, does it actually have any value for a historian at all? All books have value for historians. It just depends on what it is that you're researching. The way it's worded shows me the reading level that they expected students to have. So sure, this is a valuable source if I'm trying to understand 2006 children. Is it a valuable source for me to really understand the history of the University of Georgia and the University of Georgia's football? Not really. This is another book about Georgia football. It's called Stadium Stories. This book is written for an audience that's a little bit older. But the book itself is just a collection of stories about the University of Georgia football. It's valuable if I just want to see a few stories that pique my interest. This book, on the other hand, called College Football and American Culture in the Cold War Era, this is a very quality historical book. It was written around 2011 by a professional historian in American culture. The book has a tremendous amount of sources listed in the back. There's almost 100 footnotes per chapter from primary sources such as university newspapers to interviews. There are hundreds of secondary sources that he used to build this argument. The argument talks about the place of college football in the Cold War era. This book was written for historians. It was written for those who want to understand the place of football in American culture. It was written for those who want to understand a little bit more about the Cold War. And so for a historian studying either one of those topics, this is a very valuable historical resource. And we can see that they all have a little bit of value. At best, I can use its value to study as a primary source. But there's a vast difference between this book, published for the casual sports fan, and this one that's published by the University of Illinois Press. University presses require a lot more attention to academic detail. And so this book, very valuable for a historian. These other two, not as valuable. But yes, every source has value. We just have to find those values and find the limitations of those values. If you have any questions, put them in the comments and I'll try and answer them as best I can. Thanks for watching.